I'm Graham Smith and I'm a solution-focused hypnotherapist, and welcome to Neuroscience Now. And my talks are usually pretty simple. I like to connect science to things we experience every day. But today I'd like to take us a little deeper with some actual solid neuroscience. Let's ask one of the biggest questions of all. How does this brain work? Firstly, the human brain is made up of billions and billions of cells. Two main types, neurons and glial cells. Now, the neurons are the superstars. They're the ones that send messages around the body as tiny electrical signals. Scientists estimate that we've got around 100 billion of them, more than 14 times the population of the Earth. But neurons don't work alone. Glial cells are just as numerous. They support, protect, and nourish neurons. And for a long time, scientists thought they were just helpers. But now we understand that they play a role in the way that neurons communicate with each other. So let's take a more in-depth look at neurons, the body's communicator. What makes neurons so special is the way they're built. Each one has a central cell body which holds the genetic instructions. Sprouting out of it are the dendrites, tiny receivers that collect messages from nearby cells. And then there's the axon, a long extension that acts like a one-way street, carrying information out of the cell. Some axons are incredibly long. In fact, the longest in the human body stretches from the base of the spine right down to your big toe, about 1 metre long and all in a single cell. Now, different neurons have different jobs. Sensory neurons pick up information from the world around us: touch, taste, smell, pain. Motor neurons send signals to muscles telling us to move, chew, wave, smile or run. And then there are interneurons, the middle managers, connecting everything and helping the system flow smoothly. So how do these little cells actually talk to each other? Neurons send signals as tiny electrical impulses, and to understand this, scientists studied the giant squid, which has an axon big enough to experiment on. And using electrodes, researchers Hodgkin and Hudgley discovered the exact way that neurons fire, seeing what they did when firing and while at rest. Research so important that it won them the Nobel Prize. And here's the gist. Inside every neuron there are charged particles called ions. And they're constantly moving in and out of the cell. And the balance of them creates an electrical charge. And when a neuron is resting, it sits at a negative charge inside compared to outside. And this is called the resting potential. And it's vital because it means the neuron is primed, ready to fire when needed. Now, imagine that neuron gets stimulated by light, sound, or touch. Suddenly, the balance changes. Sodium rushes in, the charge flips from negative to positive, and this creates a spark, an action potential. That spark travels down the axon like a wave, and here's the beautiful bit. It never fizzles out, it never gets weaker. It's an all or nothing event, like pressing a doorbell. Either the bell rings or it doesn't. And as the signal passes each section of axon, voltage-gated doors open and close, passing the wave along until it reaches the end, and then the neuron resets, ready for the next impulse. This is happening constantly in your brain. Millions of sparks firing every second. Every thought, every sensation, every movement. It's why my company is called All Spark Hypnotherapy. At least that's one of the reasons. The other being the fact I like the Transformers comic and cartoons. But neurons don't actually touch each other. Between them is a tiny space called a synapse. So when the electrical impulse reaches the end of an axon, the neuron has to switch strategy. It releases chemicals called neurotransmitters into that gap. And these chemicals drift across and lock on to the next neuron, passing on the message. Think of it like tossing a note across a narrow alley. If it lands in the right mailbox, the message continues. If not, stops just there. And this is where things get fascinating, because the type of chemical released, which neurotransmitter is used, determines what happens next. So, Let's take a look at a few of the most famous neurotransmitters. Acetylcholine, the very first one discovered, controls voluntary muscle movement and also plays a role in memory. Low levels of it are linked to Alzheimer's disease. Noradrenaline, this kicks in during stress. It speeds up the heart, sharpens focus and gets us ready for action, but it also helps activate BDNF, brain-derived neurotrophic factor, a chemical I've mentioned in previous Neuroscience Now talks. And BDNF is essentially miracle grow for our brains. Dopamine, often called the celebrity or sex and chocolate chemical because it's tied to reward, motivation and pleasure. It's also crucial in movement and learning, and it's heavily involved in addiction. Serotonin, a multitasker. This one helps regulate mood, sleep, appetite, even digestion. Low levels are linked to depression, anxiety and eating disorders. I like to think of it as the contentment chemical. And finally, GABA, the calming one. Whilst most neurotransmitters excite neurons, GABA is an inhibitor. It keeps things under control so the brain doesn't overload. Without it, signals would fire non-stop, leading to seizures. Now, every one of these neurotransmitters is part of a specific system or pathway. They're like train lines across a city. Dopamine has its roots, serotonin has its roots, and so on. Each pathway is carefully mapped, influencing different behaviours. Now, before I finish today's talk, let's tackle one of the biggest myths. The one that says we only use 10% of our brain. Thanks for that, Limitless and Lucy. It sounds exciting, as if 90% of our brain power is locked away, just waiting to be unleashed. But it's just not true. Brain scans show that almost every part of the brain has a function, and even simple actions like tapping your finger uses far more than 10%. And damage to even a tiny part of the brain can cause devastating effects, which proves we need all of it. So the truth is, we already use most of our brain, and that in itself is extraordinary. So, wrapping up, how does the brain work? At its heart, it's billions of neurons sparking with electricity, passing signals through chemical messengers, coordinating everything we do. Thought, movement, memory, mood. All of it depends on these tiny cells talking to each other in an endless symphony of signals. The more we learn, the more awe-inspiring it becomes. Because every spark, every message, every connection is part of what makes you, you. Thanks for joining me. Till next time on Neuroscience Now, stay curious.